Sergeant Emily Carter sat in her patrol car, glancing dismally at the dashboard clock. The late-night silence was overwhelmingly dull, with nothing noteworthy happening throughout her shift. To her, this neighborhood was a lost cause, filled with people she believed had no future, clinging to poverty and social issues without any real attempts to improve their lives. She sighed, her eyes drifting over the rows of old, run-down buildings with closed storefronts, as if time had forgotten this place. While lost in her thoughts, Emily's gaze was suddenly drawn to a lone figure, standing under the dim light of a street corner. It was a black woman, appearing somewhat lonely as she stood there in the dead of night. She wore a large coat, holding a bag in one hand. Emily tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes as unease crept over her. To her, this woman seemed out of place on a quiet night, and her calm demeanor only made Emily suspicious. She was a difficult woman, full of prejudice toward black people, often associating them with criminal behavior. So when she saw the woman, she immediately frowned in irritation, her eyes fixed on her. Why would someone like her be here at this hour? She thought to herself, suspicion mingling with caution. In Emily's mind, this area was full of people she considered irresponsible, those who easily blamed their circumstances and seemed inclined to cause trouble. To Emily, the woman's presence at this time was a sign of something unusual, perhaps theft, smuggling, or any number of illegal activities she had encountered repeatedly throughout her career. It didn't take long for Emily to decide to act. She turned the wheel and pulled her car over to the side of the road. The car engine quieted as she parked, carefully turning off the ignition to avoid alerting the woman. Steeling herself, Emily opened the door and stepped out with the air of authority she had honed over years on the force. Her boots echoed firmly on the empty street as she approached the woman, each step radiating control and confidence, knowing she was in charge of the situation. The woman didn't turn her head, just stood there looking down at her feet, occasionally adjusting the bag, as if to steady her balance. Emily frowned, scrutinizing every tiny detail, from the way the woman held the bag, to her worn-out coat and wide-brimmed hat obscuring her face. To Emily, the woman seemed oddly misplaced and confusing, sparking a feeling of unease deep within her. Too calm, she thought, as if she's not worried at all about being here. Emily felt the urge to question the woman, driven not only by her sense of duty, but also by the belief that her authority should be acknowledged. Throughout her career, she had rarely encountered pushback for her actions. With Lieutenant Jack Harlow's cover, she had always felt justified in controlling any situation however she saw fit. She recalled handling troublemakers without a single complaint raised, and that feeling of power coursed through her now, compelling her to act immediately. She approached the woman and cleared her throat, deliberately making a noise loud enough to draw her attention. However, the woman remained still, showing none of the fear or surprise that Emily had expected. This reaction irked her even more, and she felt as though the woman was challenging her authority. Emily resolved to find out exactly why she was here at this hour and to make it clear that she didn't tolerate defiance from anyone. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Emily asked, her voice cold and authoritative. She deliberately took another step forward, closing the distance between them to just a few feet, close enough to feel each other's breath in the stillness of the night. Emily wanted to intimidate her, to make her presence force Sarah to look down, or at least show some hint of hesitation. Sarah remained still, her gaze calm and steady. The streetlight cast a faint glow on her face, her bright eyes glinting softly, yet incredibly serene. "I'm just on my way home after picking up a few things," Sarah replied, her voice gentle, unruffled, and without a hint of fear or unease. She calmly raised her bag, showing that there was nothing suspicious about it. Her demeanor seemed to say that she had done nothing wrong and had no reason to feel afraid. Sarah's composure only fueled Emily's anger. Her calmness, her fearless gaze, all of it seemed like a silent challenge to Emily. She was accustomed to people fearing her, seeing their averted eyes, forced smiles, and trembling words. But Sarah was different. Her eyes held an unbreakable calmness, a deep understanding, as though Sarah saw right through Emily's thoughts, sensing the anger simmering within her. Emily clenched her jaw, her discomfort growing by the second. "It's far too late. Are you aware of that?" she said, her tone colder than ever. "Do you think you can just stand here at this hour without arousing suspicion?" Sarah didn't flinch, Her gaze remained steady, making Emily feel as though her attempt at intimidation was in vain. "I have the right to stand here," Sarah replied, her voice steady yet soft. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm simply on my way home." Those words, calm, clear, and resolute, felt like a sharp blade to Emily's pride. She had never met someone who would look her directly in the eyes without blinking, without bowing, without any sign of fear. The defiance in Sarah's gaze made Emily feel like she was losing control, that the authority she wielded to intimidate others did not affect Sarah. Emily took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. Inside, her sense of power and control was slipping away, replaced by a void of anger and frustration. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with frustration, determined to overpower Sarah completely. "Who do you think you are, standing here in the middle of the night, acting like this place belongs to you?" But Sarah didn't waver or step back. She showed no sign of yielding to Emily's attempt at intimidation. "I don't need to act differently just because it's late," she replied, her eyes resolute yet gentle. Her tone remained steady, unshaken. "I know my rights, and I'm not doing anything wrong to make me feel scared or uncertain." Sarah's calm, the steadiness in her voice, and the unshaken look in her eyes only made Emily angrier. She felt as though her authority was being challenged, as if Sarah was silently saying, "You don't have the right to bully me. I'm not afraid of you." Emily was used to others respecting her, even fearing her authority, but now the young woman standing before her showed no hint of hesitation, even radiating confidence. For a brief moment, Emily felt as though she was facing someone far more than just a passerby. The sense that Sarah held something greater, something beyond her control, intensified Emily's frustration and discomfort. She felt challenged by the very power she always believed allowed her to control every situation. Emily's pride surged, like a flame igniting in her chest. She wanted to see Sarah falter, to see her lower her gaze and submit, but she didn't. Sarah stood there unshaken, even defiant, as if she understood that Emily's authority was merely an outer shell and held no true power against her calm resolve. In the stillness of the night, the tension between the two women grew. One stood there, powerful and arrogant, trying to dominate, while the other stood tall, calm, and confident, as if Emily's words and actions could not touch her. Under the dim light of the deserted street, Sarah stood like a mountain, solid and unmovable against a raging storm, serene, self-assured, and unwavering. Sarah's calm gaze was like a sharp thorn piercing deeply into Emily's pride, making her lose all control. Emily's breaths grew heavy, deep, and filled with rage. Unable to tolerate Sarah's cold composure any longer, she clenched her fists, stepped forward, and roughly grabbed Sarah's arm, attempting to force the woman into submission, to make her bow under Emily's authority. But Sarah stood firm, unmoved, her eyes exuding a subtle defiance that only further enraged Emily. It seemed that Emily was expecting something from Sarah, a plea, a fearful look, or at least a hint of weakness. But Sarah met her with nothing but unwavering, steady, and ice-cold eyes. This attitude drove Emily mad. She had never encountered someone so unyielding, so unafraid to resist her. A wave of anger surged through her, igniting like a spark in a barrel of gunpowder, and Emily could no longer contain herself. "Who do you think you are to stand here and defy me like this?" Emily spat, infusing her voice with all her anger, hoping for any reaction from her target. Without a second thought, she struck Sarah hard across the face, as if attempting to dispel the sense of powerlessness she had never been willing to accept. The heavy blow caused Sarah to sway slightly, but she didn't lose her balance. She didn't cry out, nor did she show any pain. She simply remained silent, looking back at Emily with calm eyes. It wasn't the calmness of someone weak, but rather of someone who had anticipated this moment, as if Sarah had prepared herself for this very situation. Suddenly, Emily felt a chill run through her, a strange premonition that the blow she had just delivered would bring about something terrible, something beyond her control. At that moment, to Emily's horror, Sarah slowly reached into her coat pocket. Emily tensed, watching Sarah's every move, her mind racing with questions about what this woman was up to. Sarah pulled out a small, glimmering object, carefully opened it, and held it up before Emily's face. Under the dim streetlight, an FBI badge sparkled, its metallic emblem reflecting the light, stunning Emily into silence. Emily froze, her eyes wide and her mouth hanging open, unable to speak. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a brutal reminder of the grave mistake she had just made. She looked from the badge to Sarah's determined face, and it was as if the world around her shattered in a haunting moment of silence. "My name is Agent Sarah Barnes. I'm investigating abuse of power and corruption within your police department," Sarah stated, her voice calm but razor-sharp, like a verdict being handed down. The truth in Sarah's words struck Emily deeply, each word piercing her disbelief. Emily's entire body grew cold as a slow, creeping terror enveloped her. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, unable to utter a single word. Everything around her became a blur, and she realized she had committed an irreversible mistake. Each word from Sarah felt like a hammer driving the final nail into her career, heavy and unrelenting. "You're an FBI agent?" Emily managed to ask, but her voice was shaky and unusually faint. Deep down, she clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding, that the badge might be a fake. But Sarah's steely gaze left her no room for such delusions. Sarah maintained her firm gaze, unyielding. "Yes, I am an FBI agent, and I'm here to investigate your abuse of authority." Her words rang out like an indictment. Emily couldn't bear it, feeling as if she were drowning beneath the weight of her own mistakes. Standing across from Sarah, Emily felt every ounce of her power drain away. Her former confidence now vanished, replaced by sheer panic. The authority she had once held with pride was now reduced to a profound sense of fear. Her legs felt weak as the realization sank in that she had crossed all boundaries, pushing herself onto a path with no escape. Sarah continued to stand there, her gaze fixed on Emily. But now, that gaze wasn't just a silent challenge. It was a symbol of justice, of the law that Emily could no longer touch. Her heart pounded wildly, each beat reminding her that the road ahead would be one of consequence, an ending she had never anticipated. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her pulse erratic, as the reality of what had just happened shattered the sense of security she'd always relied on. The truth stood before her, no longer hidden, no longer ambiguous. Sarah looked at her with a calm but piercing gaze, as though she could see through every layer of facade Emily had carefully built. The way Sarah stood there, unafraid, without a trace of fear, it left Emily both disoriented and angry, as if Sarah was holding the power that rightfully belonged to her. Sarah began to speak, her tone steady and sharp, each word cutting into Emily's pride like a blade. "Did you think you could get away with this forever, Emily? That your abuses of power would never come to light?" Every word was a blow to the arrogance Emily had cultivated. She had always believed that, with Lieutenant Harlow's protection, she could overcome any complaint, any suspicion, and the judgmental stares of others. Emily swallowed hard, trying to find a reason, an excuse, but she knew she was losing ground. "I was just doing what was necessary to maintain order," she said, struggling to keep her voice calm, though it trembled. "In places like this, if you're not firm, things spiral out of control. You wouldn't understand." Sarah gave a slight smirk, her gaze sharp and unyielding, betraying no sympathy or surprise. "You call it maintaining order when you threaten and coerce others? Or is it just an excuse to indulge your ego, to feel like you hold absolute power?" Sarah's scornful words left Emily feeling cornered, as if she were being backed into a wall. Emily lowered her head, trying to steady herself, but deep down, she knew things had spun out of control. Her defenses felt meaningless before Sarah, who was prepared to bring the truth to light. Sarah wasn't a victim who would easily cower. She was an FBI agent who had been silently observing Emily and her colleagues for a long time, biding her time to expose them. "Emily, do you think you're doing the work of a police officer?" Sarah continued, her voice strict and commanding. "A real police officer protects the people. They don't harm them or use their authority just to boost their sense of self-worth." Emily felt a flush of heat, a mixture of anger and shame, her heart pounding as if trying to break free from her chest. She knew there was no way out. Everything she'd relied upon, those promises, the invisible shields from her superiors, had now vanished like soap bubbles in the face of truth. "Sarah," Emily tried to muster some sympathy, her voice growing softer, weaker than ever. "You have to understand. Sometimes there's no other way but to use force." Sarah looked at Emily, her gaze unwavering and unyielding. "Force? Or are you just abusing your power to feed your ego?" "I've seen enough, Emily. No excuse can justify what you've done." Emily's body trembled, her gaze shifting away as memories of the fearful stares from those she'd bullied came rushing back. How long had she forgotten the true purpose of a police officer? She had become the very person she despised, a figure who abused authority under the guise of maintaining order, just to satisfy a thirst for dominance. Sarah continued, her voice as cold as a biting wind. "Did you know, Emily, Lieutenant Harlow tried his best to cover up every time you crossed the line? But now, no one can protect you. You'll have to face the truth, and every crime you tried to hide will come to light." Emily felt a knot tighten in her chest, as each of Sarah's words pulled her deeper into the harsh reality. She looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with bewilderment and even a hint of desperation. But Sarah remained there, cold and resolute. She didn't need to say more. Her silence spoke volumes. Emily would have to pay for what she had done. At that moment, Emily realized there was no escape. The years of relying on power and exploiting the protection of her superiors to commit injustices had all come back to haunt her. She couldn't evade the truth standing right before her, and for the first time, she felt real fear, a fear she couldn't escape from justice. Sarah added, her voice low but full of determination, "This time, you won't get away, Emily. Every action you took has been documented. Every abuse of power is now evidence against you. You have no choice but to face the truth and accept the consequences." Emily lowered her head, despair filling her, her eyes welling with tears. There was nothing left to say, nothing to argue. She had lost everything, her power, her freedom, and even her self-respect. Suddenly, FBI agents began to emerge from multiple directions, quickly surrounding the area. Emily stood motionless, overcome by a feeling of utter helplessness as she realized that no one was on her side and that everyone around her was witnessing her downfall. These agents weren't just any FBI officers. They were people she couldn't manipulate or intimidate. Each step they took created a heavy and tense atmosphere, dissolving every last vestige of power Emily once wielded and enjoyed. Everything unfolded like a scene in a play, one Emily never wanted to be the main character in. She tried to remain calm, but inside, a storm of conflicting emotions raged. Her mind raced with chaotic thoughts on what to do next, but they quickly dissipated under the weight of the sharp eyes and firm gestures of the agents. The truth was undeniable. She could no longer control the situation, a bitter reality that made her shiver. In the past, she'd prided herself on her ability to manipulate and dominate others, but this time, everything was out of reach. Emily remembered the times she had worked with other officers to achieve her ends. She had been the orchestrator of many complex schemes, unafraid to twist facts and undermine those who stood in her way. But now, the agents facing her were here for one purpose: to enforce justice without leaving her any avenue of escape. The feeling of powerlessness grew, cloaking her in dread. Emily, who had always felt that power was firmly in her hands, now stood alone before a situation beyond her control. She realized she had lost not only respect, but also her career, her reputation, and everything she had taken for granted. As she noticed the cameras and the judgmental eyes around her, Emily began to understand that every action she'd taken had been recorded, each abuse of power now irrefutable evidence against her. She froze as she saw the faces of former colleagues, now watching her downfall. To them, she was no longer an officer, but a criminal, an ordinary person brought low. Emily wanted to speak, to defend herself, but each word got stuck in her throat as if they no longer held any meaning. The agents moved closer, one by one, as if confirming that this was the final chapter of the power she once held dear. The cold touch of the handcuffs on her wrists brought Emily back to reality with a dizzying clarity she'd never felt before. The cuffs seemed to bite into her skin, reminding her of the harsh truth she now faced. The sound of the cuffs locking echoed in the silent air, marking the end of everything she'd built. She realized that everything she had fought for, the power she had so desperately pursued, was now a stain that couldn't be erased. Memories of her mistakes surfaced in her mind. She thought of the innocent faces she had exploited, the promises and lies she had crafted to protect her reputation. Every act of abuse, every instance of heartlessness, now haunted her relentlessly. In those final moments, Emily's thoughts swirled with a weight she had never felt before. Each slow step toward the police car reverberated in the surrounding silence, amplifying her isolation. The crowd that once surrounded her with admiration, envy, or even contempt had vanished, leaving her with an emptiness she couldn't escape. Solitude, the silent companion she had always ignored, now stood beside her, unyielding and cold. There was no more hiding. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, an invisible force she couldn't shake. As she neared the police car, Emily felt her legs weaken, as though her body was rebelling against the reality she had no choice but to face. The cold, detached gazes of the officers pierced through her, stripping away every last vestige of her defenses. Each look seemed to echo what she already knew. There was no turning back, no shadow to hide in, no door to conceal the truth. Her world, once a fortress built on control and confidence, had crumbled into ruins, taking with it the person she'd fought so hard to protect. Sitting in the back seat of the police car, Emily sank into a stifling silence. The hum of the engine, a normally mundane sound, now filled her mind with a mix of fear and resignation. Her thoughts drifted, unwillingly returning to the choices and mistakes that had led her to this moment. Visions of herself, strong and unrepentant, appeared in her memory, now laid bare as misguided steps wrapped in pride. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that her pride, the weapon she had cherished, was the very thing that led her down this path. Her mind swirled, torn between regret and denial. Could she have done things differently? Would it have mattered if she had been more cautious, less reckless? The doubts gnawed at her, prying open cracks in her mind where remorse and shame lurked, hidden in shadows she'd ignored for too long. She knew that her actions hadn't just affected herself. They had hurt others, people who had once trusted her, believed in her, or simply looked up to her. The knowledge left an ache spreading from her chest to her fingertips, a persistent reminder of the lives she had touched. As the car began to move, Emily looked down at her hands clenched on her lap. She noticed a slight tremble she couldn't control. Her mind, desperate to escape the flood of emotions, tried to focus on trivial details, the texture of her clothes, the chill on her skin, the mechanical sounds of the car. But beneath those distractions, the truth remained sharp and undeniable. The world she had crafted with all its ambitions and desires was now reduced to the shattered fragments of a life she could no longer claim. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to feel vulnerable. It was as if the armor she had meticulously built over the years had melted away, leaving her exposed to the raw, unfiltered weight of her actions. There was no one left to impress, no reason to maintain an image. The wall she had constructed now felt like a prison she had locked herself in long before the police car arrived. In a way, she was already imprisoned, bound by her own choices, trapped by the consequences she had once readily ignored. Looking out the window, Emily saw her reflection, a blurred image of the woman she used to be, staring back with hollow eyes. In that reflection, she saw her aspirations, her endless plans, in the relentless pursuit of success that had once driven her. But now, all she faced was emptiness, a void where dreams and ambitions had once thrived. She was a stranger to herself, lost amid the ruins she had created. Emily took a shaky breath, realizing that the road ahead would be long and lonely. Acceptance crept into her, like a quiet resignation, the final note in a tragic symphony. There would be no redemption, no chance to rewrite her story. In the solitude of that car, Emily knew she would face this journey alone, with only the shadows of her past as her companions. When she arrived at the police station, Emily was led into a holding cell, her wrists finally freed from the cold handcuffs, but still bearing the red, painful marks, stark reminders of the downfall she could no longer hide. She stood silently in the narrow space, surrounded by gray, peeling walls and the thick, damp smell of confinement. In that moment, Emily realized she'd been stripped of every title and authority she'd once taken pride in. She was no longer an officer, No longer a figure of power, now she was simply a criminal, imprisoned by the very consequences she had once dismissed. The scenes from earlier in the day haunted her mind. Her colleagues, once her allies, had looked at her with harsh, judging eyes as she was escorted through the hallways. Those who had worked alongside her, who had once collaborated on cases, had all turned away, treating her like a stranger, worse than a criminal. Their looks, filled with disdain and disgust, were etched into her memory, every sneer and mocking smile pressing her deeper into isolation and inescapable despair. She sank onto the cold metal cot, her head buried in her hands, her body curling inward as if to hide from the harsh reality closing in around her. Past moments, each instance of abusing her power, the fearful faces she'd once looked down on, and the cries she had ignored, all came rushing back, echoing in her mind as relentless punishments. She had once taken pride in her control, believing herself above both the law and morality. But now, in the dim solitude of the cell, each memory returned like a ghostly presence, reminding her of every wrong decision that had led her here. Her former arrogance had transformed into torment, fueling her self-loathing and an overwhelming, inescapable fear. As night fell, the silence in the cell was eerie, each tiny sound amplified, reminding her of the loneliness she couldn't escape. Emily lay on the cot, staring into the darkness, her heart pounding and breath shallow, trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts about her future. For her, the future was now an empty gray void, full of shadows and emptiness. She was no longer the strong woman she had thought herself to be. Every ounce of pride, every piece of honor she'd clung to, was gone, leaving her alone, adrift in fear and relentless regret. Footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, the murmur of other officers discussing her case, her shocking arrest, and the charges against her. Emily heard each sarcastic remark, each cutting judgment from those who had once been her peers. Every word was like a knife, cutting deep into the pride she had once built up. She couldn't bear to look anyone in the eye. Each taunt, each derisive laugh, shattered the remaining strength she'd clung to. Now, facing the scornful eyes of her former colleagues, Emily felt small, weak, and utterly helpless. In the silence and solitude of the night, she became painfully aware that she had lost more than just her freedom. She had lost the life she'd once proudly defended. All that remained was remorse and an uncertain future, a place where she couldn't find any hope of redeeming her mistakes. Days passed, and Emily felt the weight of dread closing in around her like a dark shroud. The quietness only intensified her anxiety as she thought of Lieutenant Harlow, the man who had been her superior, her ally, and the power behind the department. Emily understood that if she revealed anything about Harlow's connection to her wrongdoing, the price could very well be her life. Confronting that truth, she felt herself sinking into an inescapable spiral. Harlow's image haunted her mind. She remembered his cold stare, the calculated look in his eyes during private meetings, as if he could read her every thought. It wasn't by accident that Harlow had maintained his power for so long, orchestrating alliances and securing his position within the department. Even as she sat there, locked away, she knew that his influence lingered, and she felt as though unseen eyes were watching her every move, tracking her every word. Her fear extended beyond Harlow. Emily knew that many officers in the department were fiercely loyal to him, willing to do anything to protect his secrets. She understood that even the slightest misstep, a careless word, or any sign of cooperation with the FBI could be her undoing. Harlow was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat to his position, even if it meant silencing those closest to him. The anxiety and tension in Emily's mind grew heavier by the day. She realized she was cornered in a place where safety had become a distant luxury. Once a confident and proud officer, she now faced the reality that the very environment she had trusted had become her greatest threat. Looking around, she no longer saw familiar faces. Instead, she saw betrayal, danger, and hidden plots. Each sound from the hallway outside sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Every tiny noise, no matter how small, felt ominous, as if it heralded the approach of someone from Harlow's circle, coming to warn or threaten her. At that moment, Emily felt trapped, unable to move forward or retreat. She had no idea how to protect herself, while simultaneously understanding that the terrible consequences of her actions had left her without options. Emily lowered her head, her hands clenching tightly as she felt the cold weight of the handcuffs that had left red marks on her wrists. A chill ran down her spine as she thought of everything she'd done to maintain her power and position. Each act of oppression, each abuse of authority, every face of the innocent she had hurt seemed to appear in her mind like a slow-motion film. Those acts had once given her a sense of power and pride, but now they returned as painful memories gnawing at her conscience. At that moment, Emily felt the weight of loneliness settles over her. She had no one to lean on, no colleagues left to stand by her side. She was alone in a battle she knew would never bring victory, only helplessness and despair. She understood that even a single wrong move, one hasty step, could seal her fate under Harlow's and his associates' hands. Emily looked up, scanning the silent, confined space of her cell, wondering where her life would go from here, when all she had thought was power and protection had turned out to be nothing but an illusion. As soon as Emily was detained, Sarah and the FBI investigation team quickly sprang into action. This was no ordinary case. They knew they were up against a deep, intricate web of corruption. The FBI agents meticulously searched every hidden corner of the police department, cautiously uncovering evidence not only to convict Emily, but to expose the entire manipulated system. From dusty file rooms to locked drawers, every possible spot held the potential for crucial clues. During the investigation, Sarah and her team uncovered a small, concealed room, hidden behind a false wall in the basement, accessible only to high-ranking officers. The cramped, dimly lit space smelled of mildew and contained rows of secret files, all carefully labeled and categorized by case. These records detailed instances of power abuse, covered-up incidents, and even evidence erased from official records. Each file was a glaring testament to the deception that Lieutenant Harlow and his accomplices had built over the years. Sarah opened file after file, each page revealing disturbing secrets. She read reports on violent incidents perpetrated by Emily and other officers, victims who had been intimidated and manipulated into silence. The cases included victim testimonies and altered physical evidence, all painstakingly recorded in these files. Sarah couldn't contain her anger as she read the cold, brutal details, realizing how many lives had been destroyed by those like Emily who had abused their power. The investigation didn't stop there. The team also discovered secret emails and recorded conversations between Emily and Harlow. Their exchanges highlighted how they had collaborated to cover up their misconduct. In one email, Harlow instructed Emily on how to draft reports to avoid suspicion, reminding her that everything was taken care of. In a chilling recording, Harlow's mocking laughter could be heard as he discussed a dismissed case, bragging about how he had handled everything smoothly, leaving no trace. These pieces of evidence pierced through the police department's facade, exposing the criminal network led by Harlow and Emily. As Sarah dug deeper, she uncovered more secret calls orchestrated to cover up violent incidents and evidence tampering. The recordings revealed that, beyond Emily and Harlow, numerous other officers were also involved in this network. They divided tasks among themselves, from falsifying reports and destroying evidence to intimidating whistleblowers. All of it was executed with precision and sophistication to maintain Harlow's power and control. The evidence didn't stop at violent cover-ups. It also exposed how Harlow exploited his power for personal gain. He manipulated internal investigations, shielding officers like Emily whenever they were implicated in wrongdoing. There were even records of Harlow receiving unofficial rewards for handling cases in ways that benefited him. These findings painted a stark picture of a police force completely corrupted, where justice was merely a thin veil concealing the abuses of those in power. As the investigation progressed, irrefutable evidence gradually formed a complete picture of the crimes and manipulation that had infiltrated the system. Sarah felt a powerful sense of pride, knowing she had taken on a role no one else dared to assume. She was piecing together the final fragments of a truth the entire police department had long sought to conceal. Yet with each step closer to the truth, her anxiety grew, understanding that this was a battle both long and fraught with peril. What they had uncovered wasn't just proof of crime, but evidence that greed and corruption had ravaged a system meant to represent justice. Sarah took a deep breath, grounding herself under the weight of the mission she was carrying. This was no longer simply a case to be solved. It was a moral responsibility she couldn't ignore. The corruption ran deep, and the very essence of justice was at stake. Every late-night meeting, every piece of evidence scrutinized under dim office lights, and every encrypted message revealed a web of deceit stretching far wider than she'd ever imagined. At the center were Harlow and Emily, not just criminals, but symbols of the pervasive corruption she was determined to dismantle. Despite her resolve, Sarah couldn't shake the fear that clung to her every step. She knew there were powerful figures involved, people willing to do whatever it took to silence those who came too close. Her worry only grew as she remembered colleagues and informants who had hinted at the truth but then vanished without a trace. Would she face the same fate? Was she ready to risk her safety, even her life, in pursuit of this mission? Though afraid, a fierce determination stirred within Sarah. She thought of the innocent faces scarred by this corruption, families torn apart, lives ruined. The thought that justice might slip away, leaving victims without anyone to stand for them, kept her from turning back. Each piece of evidence, each shadowy figure, and each warning only pushed her forward, vowing not to let these crimes go unpunished. Late at night, alone in her dim office, Sarah would pore over the files once again, connecting names, locations, and dates, scrawling notes until ink smudged across her hands. With every detail that linked Harlow and Emily to countless unethical and brutal actions, her determination grew. She could see the path ahead, though it was strewn with dangers to both her career and her life. In moments of doubt, Sarah reminded herself of the importance of this mission. She knew she was facing forces larger than herself, forces capable of bending laws and distorting justice to their will. But precisely because of that, she knew she had to keep going. If she gave up now, if she allowed herself to be intimidated, then the corrupt would win, and all her years of service to justice would be in vain. Occasionally, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her friends and family, those she might leave behind if her crusade led to tragedy. She had kept her distance from them, hoping to protect them from the dangers she faced. But a sense of guilt still weighed heavily on her. She knew they worried and saw the anxiety in their eyes when she worked late and missed gatherings, always prioritizing the case above all else. This was the path she'd chosen, one few could understand, yet she remained resolute, believing that some sacrifices were necessary for a cause so high. As she pieced together the final clues, Sarah's emotions shifted from pride to a dark resolve. This was no longer just a job, it was her battle, a test of her values and courage. She knew that regardless of how uncertain the future looked, despite the warnings that haunted her thoughts, she would see it through. The truth would come to light, and those responsible would be brought to justice. In her mind, she envisioned the day the case would close, the day Harlow and Emily would be stripped bare of their misdeeds, and the system they had twisted would be restored. Sarah was ready to risk everything to make that day a reality, prepared to face whatever darkness lay ahead. As Sarah was buried in her investigation files, a call from the police station sent a jolt of dread through her. On the other end, a colleague informed her that Emily had been found dead in her cell. The unexpected news left Sarah stunned. She quickly left her desk, her mind swirling with complex emotions, anger, sorrow, and a sense of helplessness. She knew that Emily's death wasn't an accident, nor a mere suicide. This was a calculated assassination, an elaborate means of silencing someone who knew too much. When Sarah arrived at the station and entered the cell, she was shaken to see Emily's lifeless body lying still on the narrow, cold bed. Emily's eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, as if haunted by her last moments. The small cell was eerily quiet, showing no signs of struggle or disorder. Everything was meticulously arranged, casting an ominous silence over the space and creating a ghostly atmosphere. Sarah took a deep breath, stepping closer with heavy steps, as if her mind were forcing her to accept the reality that Emily was truly gone. Standing over Emily, Sarah felt a wave of sadness and pity well up inside. Despite all the mistakes Emily had made, the abuse of power, and the betrayal of trust, no one deserved to die alone in such a cold, desolate place. Sarah gently placed her hand over Emily's cold fingers. An emptiness gnawed at her, a hollowness that reminded her of a life once filled with secrets, ambitions, and regrets, all now vanished into darkness. For a brief moment, Sarah drifted in her thoughts, reflecting on the difficult path that had led Emily to this dangerous end. But then a surge of anger erupted within her, filling her chest with an uncontainable fire. Sarah knew this was no tragic accident. Emily's death was orchestrated, a silent but chilling message of Harlow's power and ruthlessness. He had eliminated Emily to protect himself, to safeguard his corrupt network. This was his message to Sarah, a sinister warning that he would stop at nothing to keep his secret safe. She clenched her jaw, trying to contain the fury rising within her, her fists tightening as a wave of resolve replaced the initial shock and grief. Harlow thought he could frighten her and force her into submission, but this act only steeled her resolve. Turning away from Emily's motionless body, Sarah looked down the narrow hallway. Outside the cell, a group of officers stood gathered, exchanging uneasy glances and murmuring in hushed voices. Their averted eyes and whispers exposed a chilling truth. They all knew, or at least suspected, what had happened, but none dared to say a word. The silence in the police station was thick and oppressive, as if the very air held a fearful tension, burdened by unspoken truths and buried loyalties. A sense of frustration rose in Sarah as she took in her surroundings. She had hoped that Emily might be the key to unraveling the corruption gripping the department, that her testimony could expose Harlow and his associates. But with Emily's sudden death, part of the truth had been buried, perhaps forever. It felt as though the hope she had clung to was slipping from her grasp, bit by bit. With a troubled mind, Sarah replayed the moments that had brought them here. The times Emily hinted at dangerous evidence she possessed, the unmistakable fear in her eyes. Now, in death, Emily had become yet another victim, silenced by those in power, a reminder of the fragility of justice in a world where corruption often goes unpunished. Sarah could almost feel Harlow's shadow looming over her, a dark reminder of the price of digging too deep. Yet faced with this threat, Sarah found herself more resolute, her fear transforming into defiance. Harlow's intentions were unmistakable, his warning undeniable. But Sarah was not someone who would yield to threats. She knew that to bring down Harlow, she would need more than just determination. She would need allies, evidence, and a plan with no room for error. As she turned to leave the cell, Sarah glanced back at Emily one last time, silently vowing that her death would not be in vain. She would push forward, whatever the cost, even if it meant facing Harlow's wrath. As she stepped into the dim hallway, the familiar sounds of the police station felt distant, almost surreal. Sarah sensed a new resolve taking root within her, a quiet, fierce determination that nothing could extinguish. In the days that followed, Emily's death haunted Sarah. Every time she recalled Emily's final image, a deep regret washed over her, as if she had failed to save the woman from such a dark end. Sarah knew all too well that Harlow had orchestrated everything with meticulous precision, leaving no evidence, no clear trace. He had calculated every move to ensure no one could follow his trail. Sarah sat alone in her office, reflecting on what she had lost. Emily's death was not just the loss of a colleague, it was a painful reminder of Harlow and his accomplices' power to conceal and evade justice with ruthless skill. But for Sarah, this death did not mark the end. If Harlow believed he could intimidate her into giving up by silencing Emily, he was wrong. She was determined to press on with the investigation, to follow even the faintest traces, and to use every resource at her disposal to bring Harlow's network into the light. Reviewing the files and evidence, Sarah promised herself she would not let this case fade into obscurity. This was about justice not only for Emily, but for all those who had suffered under Harlow's abuse of power and that of his allies. A fierce anger and unyielding determination burned within Sarah, like a flame that could not be extinguished, guiding her through fear and isolation toward a mission both perilous and profoundly meaningful. After Emily's sudden death in her cell, Sarah's resolve to bring Lieutenant Harlow's corrupt network to light only grew stronger. The evidence gathered during the investigation was becoming clearer, exposing not only abuse of power, but an underground system Harlow had carefully constructed over the years. Sarah and her FBI team prepared a plan to arrest him. They knew it wouldn't be easy to take down Harlow, who had held power and control over the police department for so long, but the injustice had to end. In the damp morning mist, the investigative team took their final step. Sarah and her team quietly entered the building where Harlow worked, every step carefully planned down to the last detail. His office was surrounded by loyal officers, those willing to protect him at any cost. But this time, Sarah had anticipated every obstacle, leaving no room for Harlow to escape. She walked straight toward his office, each firm step echoing her determined resolve through the hallway. When Harlow saw Sarah and her team at his door, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He quickly masked it, feigning calm, but Sarah caught the flash of fear in his eyes, the look of a man who knew his lies and schemes were about to be exposed. Despite his attempts to remain composed, his tension was palpable as Sarah held up the arrest warrant. "You thought you could keep running, didn't you, Harlow?" Sarah's voice was steady but firm. "Every piece of evidence we've collected lays bare your every misdeed. Today, it all ends." Harlow gave a dry laugh, his gaze dripping with contempt and defiance. "You think you can go up against me, Sarah? I've run this place for years. No one can change that. You're just a small-time agent clinging to your so-called justice. What do you think you'll achieve?" Unmoved by his taunts, Sarah replied calmly, but with unwavering conviction. "You may think you're in control, but justice has a way of bringing the truth to light. People like you can live in the illusion of power, but the truth will always prevail." Her words cut deep, each sentence piercing through his fragile pride. Although he tried to maintain his cold exterior, Sarah noticed a slight twitch in his jaw and a glint of desperation in his eyes. The unassailable truth and damning evidence left him watching as his kingdom of lies crumbled. His silence spoke volumes. Sarah stepped closer, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Every person you manipulated, every life you ruined, every ounce of power you abused, it will all come at a price. You built an empire of lies, Harlow, and now you'll watch it fall." For a moment, Harlow's defiance wavered. He looked at Sarah, attempting to regain his composure, but fear lingered in his gaze. His loyal officers also watched him with doubt, perhaps seeing his weakness for the first time. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed as Sarah's team restrained Harlow. As the cuffs locked into place, Sarah felt a momentary relief, her intense gaze softening slightly. She had spent months tracking his trail, piecing together evidence and following every secret whisper to finally bring Harlow to justice. The team escorted him down the hallway, Sarah walking alongside, her eyes never leaving him. Harlow turned to her, his voice bitter and mocking. "You think it's over, don't you?" His words were a low murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. "For you, it is, Harlow," she replied firmly. "You spent years manipulating, exploiting, and taking what wasn't yours. But power built on lies always collapses, and now you'll face the consequences." Harlow's gaze hardened as he made a last-ditch effort to intimidate, clinging to the remnants of his former power. "People like me, Sarah, we're never truly defeated. There will always be others willing to take what they want, no matter what your justice thinks." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing on her lips. "And people like me will always be there to ensure justice catches up with people like you. This is a game, Harlow, and you just lost." They reached the front of the building, where several officers waited to take Harlow away. His former allies, those who had once trusted him, stood silently, disappointment and betrayal clear in their eyes. They had followed him, believed in him, and now they finally saw who he truly was. As Harlow was led away, Sarah turned to her team. "This isn't just about arresting one man, it's about showing others that justice can't be bought or threatened. We're doing this for those who suffered under his hand, for the people who believed their voices didn't matter." Her voice was steady, reminding everyone why they had pursued Harlow without hesitation. A young colleague, Jamie, looked at her with admiration. "I never thought we'd get him," he admitted, a note of awe in his voice. Sarah smiled slightly, though her gaze remained sharp and focused. "It wasn't luck, Jamie. It was persistence. No matter how powerful someone is, there's always a way to bring them to justice. Remember that." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had given herself fully to this case, sometimes at great personal cost. And now, standing under the gray morning sky, She felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had completed her mission. For Sarah, this was not just a personal victory, but an affirmation of her belief in justice, a strong conviction that no matter how difficult the road to justice might be, it would prevail, and people like Harlow would never be able to hide forever. Sarah stood outside the station, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and a hint of surprise. In front of her was a scene completely at odds with everything Lieutenant Harlow had once represented: power, arrogance, and the belief that he stood above it all. Every day spent working alongside him had been fraught with his cold stares and condescending attitude. But today, watching him escorted before a crowd, she realized that even those who seem untouchable eventually fall. The crowd around her erupted in cheers, their faces filled with relief, as if they had shed a burden that had weighed them down for years. Some embraced one another joyfully, others raised their fists in victory, while a few simply stood in silence, following Harlow's every step with looks of contempt. For Sarah, the emotions were both unfamiliar and deeply understandable. She, too, had once thought Harlow was untouchable, a man whose commands were absolute, unquestionable. But now he was just a defeated figure, stripped of all his power. Harlow walked with a heavy step, as though each one pulled him deeper into the abyss of his failure. His eyes remained fixed forward, but Sarah knew he could feel every gaze from the crowd, every look of contempt and satisfaction around him. Memories of all the times he used his power to intimidate others, of meetings he dominated with arrogance, now seemed meaningless. This wasn't merely a loss of power for him. It was the shattering of the control he had once thought was his forever. Though he tried to maintain a mask of calm as he was led away, fear flickered in his eyes, a fear not just of losing power, but of realizing he had lost everything. Everything he had built and protected had finally crumbled into worthless pieces. Sarah felt a slight pang of sympathy, though small, as she watched Harlow in this state. He had once had a remarkable career, a position many envied, but his greed and hunger for power had led him down a path of destruction, leaving him to face only contempt from others. She wondered if he'd ever imagined it would end like this, if he'd ever regretted his choices, or if he simply never thought he would lose. As police escorted Harlow to the waiting car, the crowd cheered once more. Their cheers weren't just expressions of satisfaction, but of liberation, a declaration that corrupt power could never prevail forever. Watching it all unfold, Sarah felt not only relief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She understood that this wasn't the end, but just the beginning of a long and challenging journey. Corruption wasn't confined to individuals like Harlow. It was a deep-rooted network within the entire system. There would be many more truths to uncover, and she was committed to pursuing justice and dismantling every trace of injustice. As Sarah watched the police car carrying Harlow disappear, she felt a profound conviction that truth and justice would always prevail. Today they had proven that, and in her heart, she knew this was only the start of a future shaped by fairness. The crowd's cheers began to fade, but the trust they placed in justice grew stronger than ever. Sarah noticed that each person held a renewed hope for a future where they could live without fear of those who abused power. This moment rippled across the city, sparking protests and calls for reform, creating a powerful wave of unity never before seen. Harlow's former colleagues, who had either stayed silent or were forced to look the other way, could no longer ignore what had happened. They stood there, witnessing the downfall of a man who had been a symbol of power in the police force, reminding themselves that justice, in the end, would prevail. Some walked away quietly, regret etched on their faces, while others felt pride that true values had finally been upheld. In that peaceful moment, Sarah looked up at the sky, feeling a surge of intense determination. The fight for justice would be long and arduous, but she knew she wasn't alone. By her side were the people, a fearless, investigative team, and colleagues ready to stand with her on this journey. She wouldn't stop here. Her journey had only just begun, and she would keep fighting until every truth was uncovered and the system was truly clean. She walked through the warm afternoon light, feeling her breaths merge with the fresh air after the storms. Harlow had been brought down, but there was still much work to do to ensure that no one else would endure the injustices of the past. Sarah reminded herself that this fight wasn't just for her, but for everyone, for a new generation raised in fairness and transparency. The crowd's cheers echoed in her mind like a hopeful melody, celebrating courage and persistence. Sarah was no longer just an agent. She had become a symbol of belief in justice, a beacon guiding the community through dark days. She knew that, no matter how difficult, justice would always win, and she would continue to stand, defending those values. So the story has reached a powerful conclusion, showing that justice finds its way, no matter the odds. Do you think the outcome would have been different if Sarah hadn't been an FBI agent? Share your thoughts below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories. See you next time.